Hello, everybody. Well, I always start that way on the show, of course, though. Everybody, not everyone, everyone's coming from different places to watch Keen On or to listen. Some are coming from my RSS, traditional podcast platform, and others are coming from Substack, which I'm increasingly using to promote my work, my ideas, my video, and perhaps even my next book. And it's always nice to be joined on Substack by old friends. And I was thrilled that Nicholas Carr, one of my oldest partners, Conrad's, in fact, in terms of our writing on technology, has recently come on to Substack. He has a new Substack. It's called New Cartographies, and he's using it in part to republish excellent old posts that he's written in the past before he went on to Substack. And he began his New Cartographies with something he published back in 2012, The Arc of Innovation Bends Towards Decadence. We're going to talk about that. But Nick, welcome. Happy New Year.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to be back on the show. Happy New Year to you.
Nick, before we get to your excellent post on innovation and decadence, what do you make of Substack? Is there anything innovative about it? Why did you shift from rough type, which had always been your blog, to Substack?
Yeah, so I had been writing rough type since 2005, so 20 years now. But in recent years, and so I'd just been publishing it, using WordPress, using my own domain and stuff. And in recent years, it's kind of I've allowed it to go dormant. And some of that is because the old, what we used to call the blogosphere has kind of dissipated. It's kind of hard. I had a built-in audience, but it was hard to expand it. And so I saw Substack. I decided after I finished the new book I have that I wanted to start writing more often, more in the kind of post short essay style. And so I looked at Substack, and it seemed to have some advantages. It has a kind of built-in audience, and it has various options for subscriptions and all that. So I decided to give it a try. But really, to me, I approached it as a new technology platform for blogging, for personal publishing, and wasn't really aware that it also has this social media side to it, which I'm less used to and so far less enamored of. But as a publishing platform, it has certain advantages, I think.
Well, ironically, your new book, Super Bloom, which you're going to come on later in January or maybe in February to discuss, is a book about social media. So, Nick, let's get back to this wonderful essay that you wrote back in 2012, The Arc of Innovation Bends Towards Decadence, of course, borrowing that language from the famous speech by MLK. Did you mean that satirically or literally?
I meant it provocatively. So I'm kind of pushing the idea to its further limits. But I do think there is in the essay. I do think I make the case that decadence, that innovation has tended to move toward what we might define as decadence, as self-involvement, kind of.
So, and of course, that word decadence is itself, maybe, I'm not sure if it's a decadent word, but it's certainly a word that people use often without really knowing its meaning. So I did a little bit of snooping around on the internet, which you and I both love. And there was an AI overview of decadence from our friends at Google, who suggested that decadence is a noun that means a decline in quality or strength, or a tendency to give in to one's desires for comfort and pleasure. Is that what you mean by decadence, a kind of self-indulgence?
Yes. In that definition you just read, it's trying to bring together both the personal meaning of decadence, which I think is kind of obsessive self-indulgence, mainly through seeking pleasure. But then there's a societal meaning that is more, I think, about enervation, about a kind of loss of spirit, loss of optimism. And so I think I'm referring to both of those things. What I'm trying to do in the essay is link personal desire to forms that innovation takes. And so both of those meanings, I think, are important.
You begin the essay, you build the essay around a quote from Robert Gordon, who wrote a book about the history of technology, asking, if you could choose only one of the following two inventions, indoor plumbing or the internet, which would you choose? It's a provocative question. And I think, oddly enough, when you ask most people, they would choose the internet over indoor plumbing. Why is that an important quote, Nick?
It's very funny, because back in 2012, when I wrote this, and the quote comes from a paper that Gordon wrote in 2000, the year 2000, it was a rhetorical question originally. And even, I think he assumed that most people would obviously choose indoor plumbing over the internet in 2000. And even in 2012, I meant it as a rhetorical question, that obviously people would choose indoor plumbing. I think, as you point out, it's changed today, 12 years, 13 years later. And I think quite a few people, and maybe a majority, I'm not sure about that, would actually rather, go to the bathroom outside in an outhouse in order to keep their internet connection.
On this innovation issue, obviously the internet, and you've written about it extensively. You're one of the most distinguished, I think, writers on the history of the internet and its implications for society and politics. Does it get used differently? In terms of this arc of innovation bends towards decadence, it might in the US, which is a pioneer in some ways of technology, but is that as true perhaps in China or India or other countries outside the United States? So does it depend on the broader culture, or does the arc of innovation, in your view, always bend towards self-indulgence, to what we think of as decadent?
Yeah. Well, let me back up and just introduce the idea a little bit, because I'm building on Abraham Maslow's famous hierarchy of human needs, which is, back from 1950s, 1960s. And he made a fairly simple point that what human beings desire evolves over time. So at first, human beings desired, just to fulfill their basic physiological needs, to stay alive, to find food, to find shelter. Once they had that figured out, then that freed them to move up to desiring safety and security, and starting to build social institutions and stuff that would grant that to them. And then once you have safety and security, you start to think about love and belonging, and having relationships with other people. And once you get through that, then you start thinking about self-esteem, about yourself as an individual and what you need. And finally, in Maslow's hierarchy, he reaches self-actualization, which he saw.
Yeah, and he calls it technologies of the self on his famous pyramid.
Yeah, well, that's my pyramid. And so I'm saying that if you think about innovation, what innovation follows human desire. What we want to make, what we want to create, is things that fulfill our desires. And so if you take Maslow's hierarchy that moves from kind of physiological needs to psychological needs, you can also say that that's the same route that innovation will take, because innovators want to fulfill the needs of people. So as we've moved up from, desiring, we've gone from what I call technologies of survival, things like bow and arrows, basic weapons, chisels and stuff, to technologies of social organization, think like cathedrals, to technologies of what I call prosperity, energy systems, transportation systems, communication systems, to technologies of leisure, television, consumer goods and services, appliances. And finally, you get matching Maslow's top area of self-actualization, you get what I call technologies of the self. So I'm arguing that as a society becomes more prosperous and basic human needs are fulfilled, people start to think about themselves, and innovators start to create innovations that fulfill these needs, human needs for self-expression, and ultimately, I think, forms of decadence. So yeah, that will change depending on the culture and the society, and how prosperous it is, what the shape of its economy is. So it's not, but I will say that as societies become more prosperous, you'll tend to see this shift in the focus of innovation toward fulfilling personal needs and even kind of self-indulgent needs, and away from basic infrastructural type big technological
towards decadence. I wonder, Nick, whether there's something loaded in the way in which the Maslow pyramid exists. I mean, you're adapting it for technology, but loaded in the sense that inevitably we're going to be nostalgic for a previous age, because we're always going away from something perhaps more essential. You mentioned the technology of the cathedral. Whole books have been written about the way in which the technology of the cathedral, I can't remember the name of the book, I'm sure you remember it, focused more on our collective needs, on our communitarian needs, and we're moving more and more in an individualistic sense. Is there something about Maslow's, or the kind of the architecture of Maslow's interpretation that lends itself to nostalgia?
I don't think as Maslow saw it. He was not at all saying that as we moved up the pyramid, we were becoming more decadent. He saw it as a very idealistic process where things get better as you become more secure, more comfortable, you have food available. Then you can start thinking about self-actualization, which in his view was not, self-involvement and self-indulgence. It was this vision of people being freed to become their best selves. And he saw everybody had a certain potential, and it might be in sports, it might be in music, it might be in business, it might be in carpentry or whatever, but that each of us has the possibility to fulfill that potential as long as our kind of lower level needs were fulfilled. Now, so the idea of decadence was not in his mind. But what happened is that, he came up with this in the 50s and 60s. He died in 1970. And he put self-actualization at the top of the pyramid. And so in the 70s, we have self-actualization kind of turn into, New Ageism, Esalen, Est, all these things that were very self-indulgent. So it's only in kind of retrospect that Maslow's pyramid begins to be seen as this kind of ladder of decadence. That certainly wasn't how he saw it, but kind of human beings, in some ways, human beings failed to live up to his ideals. And rather than self-actualization meaning perfecting ourselves, it began to mean just self-indulgence, indulging ourselves. So I don't think it's a matter of nostalgia, though I do think a lot of the criticism of current innovation, and this was the spur for this article in the first place. We've had people, Peter Thiel.
Yeah, Thiel's famous remark that they promised us flying cars, and all we got were 140 characters.
Yeah, and other people, Tyler Cohen, who wrote a popular book about this. So there is this sense, and this started with Robert Gordon, who we talked about earlier, who he laid out kind of the stream of huge innovations from like 1876 to 1890. And it's amazing when you look at it. And then you compare it to today, and it's kind of this trickle of things. So there is, I don't know if it's so much nostalgia as simply a recognition that we seem to be more ambitious 100 years ago than we are now, or maybe we had more ways to be ambitious in innovation. But anyway, there is this general sense that innovation has become more trivial over the last 50 or so years.
Nick, you and I have both written about the merging of the counterculture of the 60s and the digital revolution. And guys like Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs have feet in both camps. Is this part of this shift to decadence within innovation? Did you think the history of technology took the wrong turn, took the wrong fork in the road in terms of merging? I mean, obviously, there's nothing conscious about this and nothing can be rewritten. But does it become increasingly problematic that the culture of self-actualization that was articulated in the 1960s became the digital revolution?
I certainly think we've seen kind of a similar trend in the digital revolution in the computer industry, where, when the PC came along and you had people like Steve Jobs talking about it as really a self-actualizing machine, that people would be able to use it to be more creative, more thoughtful, to become, in Maslow's terms, kind of their best potential, their best self.
Yeah, I mean, Jobs wrote a famous essay about, what was it, about riding a bicycle?
Right. And I'm trying to remember exactly the quote.
Yeah, I can't remember what it was, but basically technology becomes our bicycle for self-actualization.
Yeah, I think he said the personal computer was a bicycle for the mind.
Right.
And so there was this, and again, this is this very idealistic view. And what we've seen in some ways, I think this backs up my argument, is that as computer systems in media converged, instead of it being a bicycle for the mind, it becomes a kind of quagmire for the mind. And we see much more we see the computer network becoming, as it becomes a media, more of kind of a site for vanity, and kind of this self-expression, but at a kind of almost compulsive sort of, attention-seeking way.
Narcissism, not just vanity, but vandalism.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is one of the subjects of the new book, and I know we'll be talking about that late at some other point, but there is this kind of, we've created a system, we've created a technological system that I think is in conflict with human nature. And instead of bringing out the best in us, it tends to bring out the worst in us. So that's a bigger story.
And that, of course, rooted in the idea of human nature being itself something that we can define. And when you write about your new book, Super Bloom, we're going to do a show on it later this month or in February. You talk about welcome to the poppy field, which I'm sure you meant ironically, in the sense that some of this technology is deeply addictive and perhaps goes against our human nature.
Well, goes with our human nature in many ways, and in ways that we haven't fully taken responsibility for. So even when we, people look at social media, they see the problems it causes in terms of, from interpersonal relationships to politics. And we've been quick to say, well, this is the fault of big tech companies, the fault of the algorithms, oligarchs, our new techno oligarchs and stuff. And sure, there's a lot of blame to go around, and I don't let them off the hook. But I think what really we have to understand our own complicity in it. And I look a lot at the psychology of interrelationships and communication and self-expression. And it's very clear that when you give people too much communication, too many messages, too many ways to express themselves, you actually trigger a lot of our worst instincts. And I think that's what we're struggling with now, this fundamental conflict between what the technology wants to do and how human nature works.
Yeah, and that parable has been told many times before, and we'll talk about it more in your new book. Going back to this excellent essay, Nick, from 2012, The Arc of Innovation Bends Towards Decadence. Back then, we looked at technology differently, and the zeitgeist was very different back in 2012. Cast your mind back. What was 2012 like when it came to how we thought about innovation and new technologies, particularly digital technologies?
Well, we have to remember in 2012, this is basically the year that the smartphone displaced the desktop and the laptop as the main computing device for individuals. And now it's certainly by far the main computing device. It's the one we carry around with us. It was also, social media was blossoming then. So it had gone from kind of early adopters and students to everybody joining Facebook. App stores were still fairly new, which was, we forget about that all of these things are less than 20 years old because they've reshaped computing. That they've also, I think, reshaped our lives and society. So I think there was still a great deal of excitement because things seemed to be changing quickly in new kinds of technologies that were quite different from what we had before were coming along. I also think that we had begun to feel a certain trepidation about technology. So it was very different from, 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier when the internet truly seemed like it was going to bring, some kind of utopia, democratic utopia to media and to politics and everything else. So I think there was still in 2012, there was still a great deal of excitement in this sense of exploring something new, in a great deal of hope, even for things like Facebook, which seems strange now in social media. But there was also people were more skeptical than they had been. So there were worries, more about how it was influencing our attention span and the way we were thinking. I think we were still very optimistic about the social implications, this sense that we'd all be able to talk with each other, we'd all be able to express ourselves, we'd overthrow the media gatekeepers, and this would lead to a more democratic media, but also a more open, pluralistic, more understanding society. So 4 or 5 years later, that all changed again.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it's probably more than coincidental that you wrote this in 2012. Social psychologists like Jonathan Haidt have noted, and he's not alone in noting this, that in 2012, there was a sharp decline in people's self-confidence, a massive rise in what he calls our age of anxiety. It's hard to remember exactly why 2012 was different from 2011 or 2013. But in your sense, are people like Haidt right that that something changed around this time, particularly in people's self-confidence, people's sense of self, their anxiety, especially, of course, younger people? Do you think that's true?
I think it is true. I think it's somewhere between 2010 and 2012. And I think the reason is that it was at that point when, around 2012 is when people, including very young people, teenagers, most of them had smartphones. And so what you can see is a trend line that starts around there. And, you can debate whether it's 2010 or 2012. He says 2012, which is fine. But if you look at measures, particularly among teenagers, 20-something, young people whose social lives were very wrapped up in the technology and social media, you see pretty dramatic increases in anxiety, depression, and there's been a lot of controversy of whether it's, is this really caused by the technology or is it just a correlation? There's some other cause. But I think if you look at his work and work by Jean Twenge and others, it's very, very hard, without putting your head deep into the sand, to say that these two phenomena, the kind of despair, loneliness, worry, anxiety that's been rising quite sharply since then, it seems to me clear at this point that it's connected to social media and smartphones. There may be other causes as well. I'm sure there are other influences, but to deny that connection, I think at this point is really irresponsible.
More than 12 years later, Nick, after 2012, now at the beginning of 2025, what's changed? Is it the zeitgeist, our suspicion of technology? It seems as if we use it as much as ever. It's if anything, it's more ubiquitous. How would you summarize what's happened in the last 12 or 13 years in the context of your excellent essay, The Arc of Innovation Bends Towards Decadence, which you wrote in 2012? Do you think your thesis is stronger now than it was in 2012?
Certainly I'm not sure in general, if you look at innovation in general, it is, but I think if you look at digital technologies, I certainly think it is. It's the argument is stronger now. I think, what we've seen is over the last 12 years is a change in attitudes among people, a growing awareness of the problems, the social problems that social media and other online communication causes, and also the personal problems in terms of a loss of attentiveness and a kind of general sense of being overwhelmed with information, being anxious because you're kind of exposed to everything all the time. But we haven't seen a change in behavior, as you point out. So it's pretty clear that even though we have a lot of problems with this and we see the problems, it's very, very hard at this point for people to disentangle themselves from the online world. And I think the reason is that we've kind of, in those years, we've kind of shifted the site of our lives in a kind of fundamental way from the physical world where you had, temporal and spatial boundaries around various parts of your social life, to the virtual world where everyone is there all the time. There's no solitude anymore. And it's this weird, there's this term in psychology called miswanting, where people desire things that actually make them unhappy or leave them unsatisfied. And I think the internet has become a site of miswanting, that we love the stimulation, we love the sense of being able to, spout off about everything. We love just seeking information. One thing we know is the human psyche is a seeking psyche, and yet it leaves us unfulfilled. It often leaves us anxious and depressed. So we have this huge case of miswanting going on with our technology.
It's rather like Chinese food, isn't it? The more we eat, the hungrier we become.
It is a similar.
Of course, I'm against Chinese food, Nick. I don't want to get into trouble with our Chinese audience.
I actually haven't felt that to be true with Chinese food, but that is an old saying, and it certainly seems to be true with the internet.
So coming back, and I think you summarize it. You and I usually agree on these sorts of things. I think you summarize it pretty accurately. Coming back to your essay in 2012, The Arc of Innovation Bends Towards Decadence, I wonder whether we could argue that today we're increasingly living, not just in technological, but political, cultural terms, in a decadent age. The Wikipedia entry for decadence talks about postmodernist connections to decadence. There's a very strong postmodern quality, I think, to the internet. And of course, the kind of characters now, particularly in the second Trump administration, Trump himself seems exhibit A in our decadent age, but people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Elon Musk, they seem to be particularly decadent kinds of characters. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, that's a tough one, because I don't think they. I mean, those are three different, very different people. I certainly think.
You mean Trump, RFK Jr., and Musk, but they're all in,
yeah,
so to speak, in bed together.
They're all. They all certainly think they're right, and I don't think have much interest in hearing thoughts, opinions, or seeing evidence that disagrees with them. Now, is that decadence? I suppose in some ways, because you're talking about simply being intoxicated by your own thoughts.
Right, it's that intoxified quality. I mean, Trump is clearly a card-carrying narcissist. RFK has a long history of addiction. Elon Musk seems to be high the whole time. So maybe it's kind of, in a weird way, a loss of agency.
Yeah, with emphasis on weird, because there's a kind of loss of agency with also combined with this kind of manic sense of total agency. And so it's a very strange, certainly Musk, when he thinks about himself, is not thinking about someone who lacks agency. I think he thinks of himself as having more agency probably than anyone on earth, which he probably measures in terms of wealth as well.
And in a sense he does, and of course it goes both ways.
Yeah. And so I think when you look at Musk as an innovator, in some ways he's the opposite. He goes against the trend that I'm describing. He's more of a Edison or Henry Ford character, both strange guys, by the way. But he is looking, if the general arc of innovation following human desire goes toward self-indulgence, toward, Facebook and, psychoactive pharmaceuticals and stuff that is aimed at changing internal states. Musk seems to go in a different direction, space exploration, electric cars, battery systems, tunnels, these are kind of large scale innovations. So I think in some ways, Musk is a very interesting character who both kind of evidences some of the drift I'm talking about toward self-indulgence and self-involvement and decadence. And on the other hand, as an innovator, is more in the mode of what we saw 100 years ago, focused on big visible systems that have the potential to change how the world works and how it looks. So he's kind of a rare bird, I think.
Well, I think RFK Jr. is similar in the sense that some of the things he's trying to do, challenging, if not big tech, big pharma, seem quite interesting. And on the other hand, he's clearly, there are a lot of questions about him too. So maybe I've got an upcoming interview with Lisa Genova, who's a very influential writer on neuroscience. She has a new novel out about bipolarity. I wonder, in a kind of odd way, whether both with Musk and JFK, our new age is a bipolar one in an odd kind of way, leading to great excitement, but also deep depression and darkness.
I think that is an accurate way to describe it. And I think you see that reflected in what gains attention in digital media, in social media. It's not the kind of thoughtful, careful, middle ground kind of thinking and writing. It tends to be extremes. And we can see very, very clearly, extremes of both sides that gain attention, that go viral. And so in some ways, the technology itself is encouraging this push to extremes. And whether those extremes match up perfectly with bipolar disorders, maybe not, but there's certainly an echo of that there.
Yeah, I mean, it may not be coincidental that we have this, if not an epidemic of bipolar disorder, certainly more and more prominence to it. And we have a bipolar culture. In 2025, Nick, don't need me to tell you this, the big new technology, the new thing is AI. It seems to me, and we were chatting about this before we went live, the jury is still out on whether or not AI will be used in a particularly decadent way or in a way that's more genuinely innovative. What's your take on AI and decadence when it comes to the arc of innovation?
Yeah, you're right, and I totally agree that it's very, very hard at this point to see how all of this is going to play out, and there's lots of different frontiers going on. But I do think if you look at AI in the form of chatbots, ChatGPT and stuff, large language models, automating human expression, basically, then I do think there is a fundamentally decadent quality to that. I think back, there's that famous quote from a French playwright, I think in one of his plays, where one of the characters says, "As for living, our servants will do that for us," which is kind of a perfect enunciation.
I don't know that quote, but it sounds brilliant.
Yeah, I think it's Villiers or something, a perfect kind of enunciation of decadence. And you could say something similar when you think of people, and I think this is happening, we know this is happening all over, beginning simply to let the AI speak for them. It's almost like as for speaking, we can let our machines do that for us. And if like me, you think that,
speech, and certainly writing for us. I mean, everyone's doing that, right?
Writing, I'm including writing in speech. So writing, compose, it's almost these creative acts that to me are fundamental to the definition and formation of a self. We seem very happy to say, "Oh, let the machine do it. It's quick. It actually can write better than me. Maybe I can both. It can write for me, and I don't want to take the time to read a book, so I'll just put the whole book in, and I'll get a 2-page summary, and it's a pretty good summary." So there is this kind of these kind of pursuits that seem essential to what's interesting about human beings: writing, creating, reading. We seem very happy, or at least to simply hand them off to machines because the machines are quicker and easier. And
in other words, outsourcing humanity is
right.
A very good example. I mean, it's the most extreme example of our decadence. Maybe machines. I don't know whether machines can be decadent too. Maybe in the future, machines can be decadent. Do you, by the way, Gary Marcus, who was on the show recently, I'm sure you're familiar. He's like you, a skeptic on a lot of this stuff. Even he acknowledged that full AGI is inevitable by mid to late century. Do you agree with him?
No, I don't think you can say it's inevitable. I remember these are two different things, but I remember it, and I'm sure you remember in 2010, Google introduced the self-driving car prototype, everybody said, including big experts in the technology, within 10 years, by 2020, you're not going to have, the only thing that will be sold is self-driving cars. You're not going to have cars in which human beings are going to drive anymore. Clearly, that did not happen, and it's not even close to happening. And what I think it shows is that for a lot of really, really difficult technological problems, and particularly AI problems, getting to 90 or 95% of the goal is actually turns out to be fairly easy. But then you run into big, big problems at the end where there are qualities to human perception, human thinking, human action that turn out to be very, very difficult for machines to take on. So I wouldn't rule out, I'm agnostic on the question. I wouldn't rule out true, AGI appearing, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion at all.
Yeah, and you wrote about this. One of your lesser well-known books, which I really enjoyed, was the glass cage automation and us, which you wrote in 2014, just after, of course, your essay. So you've written about this before. Nick, couple more quick questions, and I know you got to go. So what could AI or what should AI be used for that isn't decadent? How can AI help us? How can it be genuinely innovative, in your opinion?
Well,
easy question.
The line between those two things is very, very fuzzy, but I do think that one thing AI can do is challenge our preconceptions. It can give us another important input to our thinking, and one that often will challenge our instincts. But I think what's important is to see it as an input rather than as the answer. And so I think I think we'll see, and again, I have no idea how this is going to play out, but I do think we're going to see big changes. The question is, will we be lazy and simply let the machines do our thinking and speaking and writing and reading for us? Or will we go back to kind of the Steve Jobs view of technology being a bicycle for the mind and see it as something that we can work with, but aren't dominated by?
Yeah, and there's so much more to discuss, and we'll talk more about it, I think, in your Super Bloom, our Super Bloom conversation later in the month. Finally, I love the name of the new Substack. It's classic Nick Carr, New Cartographies. You're talking, of course, about maps. Back in the 18th century, I think Spanish cartographers drawing North America. Imagine California as an island. Today, we're, of course, confident that our version of America, where California is not off the coast, is accurate. What do we take for granted, Nick? What cartographies do we take for granted that in 50, 100, 200 years we'll look back and think, God, those 21st century people were so ignorant?
Well, I think I'll give you two answers. One is kind of a positive one, that we'll be smarter in the future, and the other is the opposite. I think we might come to understand that with computers in particular, we came to believe that they could do everything for us, that they were the all-purpose tool for all human activities, human thoughts. And they kind of shaped, to put it in a kind of cartography form, they kind of shaped the landscape of our thoughts and even our actions and our perceptions. In that, I think that was a very large mistake we made, and we're still in the middle of it. We basically, instead of saying what's the right tool for the job and seeing that computers and AI and other things are the right tool for some jobs, but they're not the right tool for other jobs, that we've kind of made this mistake. The kind of darker new cartography is that we will abandon the physical world that we have over the course of so many centuries been so careful to map for a much more virtual existence, in which our bodies become less and less important, and we live kind of symbolically as sort of abstraction, media content, abstractions among other abstractions. And so the whole idea of the physical world as being the kind of site of our lives will seem increasingly foreign to us. So that, to me, that's for some people in Silicon Valley, that's the utopian.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is we will literally and metaphorically become data. We will merge with data.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes. That's how we will think of ourselves. That's how we will perceive things. That's how we will interact with each other.
Well, I think Steve Jobs had it wrong. Computers aren't bicycles for the mind. Talking to Nicholas Carr is a real bicycle for the mind. Nick, Happy New Year. Great to talk again. And I will look forward in the next few weeks to talking about your new book, Super Bloom. It's an important new book. Makes a lot of sense about the social media revolution. So I'll look forward to talking to you again then. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure.